Giant Apache woman lived alone for years until 7 blonde cowboys needed shelter from storm. Snow whips across the high Colorado Valley. A single cabin stands against the blizzard, its lantern glowing through the white fury. Inside, a towering Apache widow grips her rifle alone, hardened by years of silence. Then thundering hooves. 7 blonde cowboys stagger to her door, half frozen, desperate for shelter. She should have sent them away. Instead, she opened her fire to them and something more. But mercy carries a price. Behind the storm waits a ruthless syndicate, hungry for her land. Whispers spread through town, prejudice, greed, and the promise of blood. The cowboys call her mother, but enemies call her claim a lie. Now, her lonely cabin has become a battleground. Faith will be tested. Family will be forged. And the valley will never be the same. Will she lose everything her husband died? To protect or find a family worth dying for? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled like 1,000 hungry wolves across the Colorado plains, whipping snow into stinging clouds that cut visibility to mere feet. 7 brothers, their blonde hair crusted with ice, urged their stumbling cattle forward through the deepening drifts of the 1878 blizzard. Can't see a blessed thing. Luke, the eldest, shouted over the wind's roar. His voice barely carried to Sam riding beside him. The cattle bunched together, their broad backs white with snow, moving slower with each passing hour. Behind the herd, young Jamie, just 16, swayed in his saddle. His face had gone pale as the snow itself. Luke, third-born Thomas, called out in alarm. Jamie's about done for. Jamie's horse stopped, and the boy slumped forward, his fingers frozen to the reins. Within seconds, his brothers converged around him, their own exhaustion forgotten in their concern. "Get him up," Luke ordered, his voice rough with worry. "Matthew, Daniel, take his arms." The 2 middle brothers reached for Jamie just as he started to slide from the saddle. They caught him, his lanky frame light in their grip. The boy's eyes fluttered, showing whites like a spooked horse. "We gotta find shelter," Sam said, scanning the white wasteland, "or we'll lose more than the cattle tonight." As if in answer to a prayer, a faint golden glow pierced the curtain of snow. Hope surged through the brothers like a shot of whiskey. "There," Luke pointed. Light might be a homestead. They left the cattle huddled in the lee of a small rise, knowing the beasts would bunch together for warmth. Jamie hung between Matthew and Daniel as they trudged through knee-deep snow toward the light. The wind cut through their wet clothes. Like knives, and ice formed on their eyelashes, after what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes. They reached a sturdy cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. Luke's numb fist pounded on the thick wooden door. "Hello," he called out. "Please, we got a sick boy here." The door swung open with surprising speed. Lamplight spilled out, along with blessed waves of heat. But it was the figure in the doorway that stopped them cold. A woman stood there, as tall as any man and broader in the shoulder than most. Her black hair was pulled back, severe-like, and her face showed the high cheekbones and proud bearing of Apache. Blood? Most striking was the Winchester rifle she held with casual confidence. For a long moment, the brothers stared at her, and she at them. Snow swirled between them, while Jamie shivered violently between his brothers' supporting arms. Her dark eyes took in their desperate state, lingering on Jamie's slack face. Without a word, she stepped back and gestured them inside with the rifle. "Barrel in," she commanded, her voice deep and firm. Before you freeze solid, they didn't need to be told twice. The brothers stumbled through the door. Tracking snow and carrying Jamie, the cabin's warmth hit them like a physical blow, making their frozen faces and hands sting fiercely. By the fire, the woman directed, pointing to the hearth where flames danced high. "Get those wet things off before you catch your death." Alkes hesitated, glancing at the strange woman. "Ma'am, we're much obliged, but no time for manners." She cut him off. "Your brother's got frostbite setting in. Wet clothes off now." There was such authority in her voice that they found themselves obeying before they could think better of it. They peeled off frozen coats and boots while Matthew and Daniel tended to Jamie, who was starting to come around in the warmth. The woman moved about the cabin with efficiency, gathering blankets and stoking the fire higher. She filled a kettle and hung it over the flames, then pulled down mugs from a shelf. "I'm Inez Nate," she said as she worked. "This is my homestead." "Luke Thornton, ma'am," the eldest replied, then indicated each brother in turn. "My brothers Sam, Thomas, Matthew, Daniel, John, and that there's Jamie." Inez nodded once, accepting the information without comment. She pressed mugs of hot coffee into their trembling hands, then turned her attention to Jamie. The boy sat closest to the fire, slowly regaining his color. "Drink," she ordered, holding a mug to his lips. Jamie sipped obediently, color flooding back into his pale cheeks. The brothers watched her, still uncertain but grateful for her help. The cabin was neat as a pin, with everything in its place. A bed stood in one corner, its quilt precisely folded. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, and the smell of beans simmering on the stove filled the air. "You're alone out here?" Sam asked carefully, warming his hands around his coffee mug. Inez's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "My husband's gone 3 years now. He was an Army Scout, got the land patent through his service." Understanding dawned in their eyes. A widow then, and an Indian woman at that, holding on to her land alone. It explained both her wariness and her capability. "We're pushing cattle north," Luke explained. "Storm caught us worse than we expected. Wouldn't have troubled you, but Jamie here? No trouble," Inez said shortly. She moved to the stove and began dishing up bowls of beans, adding thick slices of cornbread on the side. "Eat. Then we'll see to your cattle." The brothers exchanged glances. "Our cattle?" Thomas asked. "I can't leave them out there to freeze." Inez said matter-of-factly, "Got a barn. Won't hold them all, but the weakest ones can shelter there. Rest will do better in the corral with the windbreak." "That's mighty kind, ma'am," Luke said carefully. "But we wouldn't want to impose." Inez fixed him with a stern look. "Your brother would have died out there tonight. The cattle, too, likely. I've got space and sense enough to help. No more argument." There was something in her voice that brooked no opposition. The brothers found themselves nodding, accepting both her authority and her assistance with growing respect. They ate quickly, the hot food bringing life back to their frozen bodies. Jamie recovered enough to eat 2 bowls, color returning to his face. All the while, Inez moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, hanging their wet clothes to dry and laying out extra blankets. When they'd finished eating, she handed out heavy wool coats. "My husband's," she explained briefly, "for getting the cattle in." The brothers donned the borrowed coats and followed her out into the storm. Working together, they brought the cattle into the relative shelter of her corral and barn. The animals were glad enough for the protection and soon settled into munching the hay Inez provided. Back in the warmth of the cabin, the 7 brothers looked at their unexpected savior with new eyes. She'd worked alongside them without complaint, her strength matching theirs, her knowledge of the land and animals evident in every decision. "We can pay you," Luke offered, "for the trouble and the feed." Inez waved away his words. "No need. There's space enough to sleep by the fire. We'll see what the storm does come morning." The brothers spread their bedrolls on the floor, exhaustion catching up with them now that they were warm and fed. Jamie was already half asleep, wrapped in one of Inez's blankets. As they settled down, they watched their hostess move about the cabin, banking the fire for the night. Her movements were sure and practiced, speaking of years of self-reliance. Yet there was something else there, too, a kind of lonely strength that resonated with their own orphaned state. "Thank you, Miss Nate," Jamie murmured sleepily. "We'd have been goners without you." Inez paused in her work, something softening briefly in her stern face. "Sleep now," she said, her voice gentler than it had been all evening. "You're safe enough here." The brothers exchanged glances in the dim firelight, sharing an unspoken thought. They'd expected to find either rejection or death in the storm. Tonight, instead, they'd found unexpected mercy in this solitary woman's cabin. It was a gift none of them would soon forget. The wind howled like a wounded beast outside the cabin walls, but inside, warmth and the smell of wood smoke wrapped around its occupants like a protective blanket. Inez moved through her cabin with practiced steps, pulling stored quilts from a cedar chest. The soft thump of each blanket landing on makeshift cots punctuated the storm's rage. "These'll keep you warm enough," she said, her voice carrying that same quiet authority that had marked her earlier actions. The brothers murmured their thanks, still somewhat in awe of their towering hostess, from a trapdoor in the floor. Inez drew forth potatoes, dried meat, and more cornmeal. Her cellar stores, carefully maintained through years of solitary living, would feed these unexpected guests. She didn't hesitate in her generosity, though any frontier dweller would know the precious value of winter provisions. Jamie, the youngest, sat closest to the fire, his fingers and toes still tender from the frost. Inez knelt beside him, examining his extremities with careful hands that seemed too gentle for their size. From a small medicine chest, she withdrew a tin of salve. "This'll help with the frostbite," she said, applying the medicine with maternal care. "My grandmother's recipe. Herbs and bear fat." Thomas, the third eldest, had been trying to hide a torn sleeve, but Inez's sharp eyes missed nothing. Without a word, she retrieved needle and thread, then gestured for him to remove the shirt. He did so sheepishly, and she set to work mending the tear with neat, even stitches. When the time came for the evening meal, Inez bowed her head. "We'll pray first," she announced, her tone brooking no argument. The brothers, surprised but respectful, followed suit. The cabin fell into complete silence save for her clear, strong voice, offering thanks for shelter from the storm and food to fill their bellies after supper. As they sat around the fire, the weight of their situation settled on the brothers. Luke, the eldest, finally spoke what they'd all been thinking. "Ma'am," he began, his voice heavy, "we've lost near half our herd already, I reckon." This storm, he shook his head, unable to finish. Inez nodded, understanding in her dark eyes. "The winter's been harsh, worst in years. Ain't never seen anything like it," Sam added, staring into the flames. Pa would have known what to do, but the mention of their father brought a momentary silence. But then Daniel, always quick too, light in a mood, began telling stories of their father's worst cattle-driving disasters. Soon, laughter rusty from disuse began to fill the cabin. The brothers shared tales of their past mishaps, each trying to outdo the other with increasingly outlandish stories. Inez watched them as she worked, noting how their shoulders gradually relaxed, how their eyes brightened. Though she maintained her stern demeanor, something in her own posture softened as the cabin, so long silent, rang with male voices and unexpected mirth. Dawn arrived with less fury in the storm, though snow still fell steadily. Ches rose before any of the brothers, as was her habit, and soon had porridge bubbling over the fire. The smell roused her guests one by one as she ladled the hot breakfast into bowls. The brothers began to notice details about the cabin they'd missed in last night's desperate entrance. There was only one chair at the small table, though it was sturdy and well made. A single plate sat in the dish drain alongside one cup and one spoon. On a small shelf near the bed, a Bible lay alone, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Matthew, always the most observant of the brothers, watched as Inez moved through her morning routine. Every motion was practiced, efficient, shaped by years of solitude. She seemed to have forgotten how to allow for the presence of others in her space, occasionally startling slightly when she turned and found someone in her path. Miss Nate. John ventured during a lull in the meal, begging your pardon, but why do you stay out here all alone? Surely there's safer places, easier places for a... He hesitated. Not wanting to say woman alone, Inez's face grew still, and for a moment they thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of years. This land was my husband's dream. He served the army as a scout, earned the patent fair and square. Her hand unconsciously touched a silver band that hung on a cord around her neck. 3 years ago, he rode out to help track some raiders. Never came back. The brothers exchanged glances, understanding flooding their faces. They knew about loss, about holding on to what remained of loved ones gone too soon. But why stay? Jamie asked softly. All alone out here. Inez's eyes met his, and for a moment her stern mask slipped, revealing a deep well of loneliness that matched their own. This was his promise to me. Our home, our future. She straightened her shoulders. I won't give it up. Not to weather, not to raiders, not to folks who think an Apache woman has no right to good land. The brothers nodded, respect deepening in their eyes. They understood about promises, about holding on to dreams that others said were impossible. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. The sound seemed to break the moment's spell, and Inez returned to her tasks with renewed energy. But something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere. The brothers moved with more confidence now, anticipating her needs, helping with morning chores without being asked. As they worked together, Inez found herself remembering how it felt to have others around, to hear multiple footsteps on the wooden floor, to cook for more than one. She hid these feelings behind her usual stern expression, but her movements had lost some of their rigid efficiency. The cabin, which had stood as a solitary outpost for so long, seemed to embrace its temporary transformation into a home filled with family. The brothers' voices, whether laughing, arguing, or simply talking, filled spaces that had known only silence for years. And though Inez maintained her position of authority, there was a new warmth in her commands, a hint of maternal care in her stern instructions. In quiet moments when she thought no one was watching, Inez would pause in her work, letting the sound of the brothers' conversations wash over her. In these moments, her face would soften, showing a glimpse of the loneliness she usually kept hidden behind her capable exterior. And the brothers, dealing with their own orphaned grief, recognized in her something they'd been missing, the steady presence of someone who cared enough to command, to correct, to protect. The morning brought a lessening of the storm's fury. Though snow still fell, the savage wind had died down to occasional gusts. Through the cabin's frosted windows, the brothers could see drifts piled shoulder high against the walls. Needs clearing, Inez stated simply, pulling on a heavy coat. Or will be buried come next storm. Luke nodded, already reaching for his own coat. We'll help, ma'am. Least we can do after your kindness. The other brothers quickly followed suit, eager to repay their hostess's generosity. Outside, the air bit cold and clean. Inez directed them with the same quiet authority she'd shown inside, organizing the brothers into teams. Some would shovel paths to the barn and woodpile, while others would split more firewood. Matthew and John took up axes at the chopping block, their rhythmic strokes sending chips flying. Daniel and Sam tackled the deepest drifts, while Luke and Thomas cleared the path to the barn. Jamie, still recovering from his brush with frostbite, was set to stacking the split wood under the cabin's eaves. Inez worked alongside them all, her strength matching any of theirs. The brothers exchanged impressed glances as she hefted logs that would challenge most men. Years of solitary labor had hardened her muscles and honed her efficiency. Near midday, as Daniel and Sam worked to clear snow from behind the cabin, their shovels struck something solid. Brushing away more snow revealed a cellar door, half buried and frozen shut. "Miss Nate," Daniel called out. "Found something here, needs attention." Inez strode over, frowning at the ice-sealed door. "Root cellar," she explained. "Needs clearing before the ice damages the hinges." The brothers attacked the task with renewed vigor, clearing not just the door, but a wide path around it. As they worked to break the ice's grip, the door suddenly gave way with a crack. Sam lost his balance and stumbled, his shoulder hitting the door hard. It swung open with a protesting groan, revealing wooden steps descending into darkness. "Careful," Inez warned, but it was too late. Sam's foot caught on something at the top of the stairs, a wooden trunk that had been hidden by snow and shadow. It tumbled down the steps with a series of thuds, its lid springing open at the bottom, tap papers scattered across the cellar floor. Inez's sharp intake of breath had Sam apologizing immediately. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We'll gather everything up." Good as new. But Inez was already descending the stairs, her movements urgent. The brothers helped collect the scattered documents, trying not to read them, but unable to avoid noticing official seals and formal letterheads. "These look mighty important," Luke said carefully, holding out a stack of papers. Inez took them with hands that trembled slightly, the first sign of uncertainty the brothers had seen in her. She spent several moments checking each document, making sure nothing was missing. Finally, she spoke, her voice tight. "These are my husband's papers, the land patent for this valley." She held up one document, its official seal still clear despite age. "He earned it fair, serving as a scout for the Army. Tracked hostiles, saved soldiers' lives. They gave him his choice of unclaimed land." The brothers listened intently as she continued her usual reserve cracking. "He chose this valley. Good water, sheltered grazing. Said it would be our future." Her hand went to the silver band at her neck. "Even after he was gone, the Army's paperwork protected me. Their bureaucracy moved slow, but it kept the land grabbers away. But not anymore." Thomas asked quietly, noting the worry in her eyes. Inez shook her head. "Railroads pushing west. Their men came by last month, talking about grazing routes and track layouts. Offered to buy me out." Her jaw tightened. "When I refused, they started. Talking about eminent domain, about how no one would believe an Apache woman's claim to white man's papers." The brothers exchanged dark looks. They'd seen similar tactics used against other small landholders along the railroad's path. "That ain't right," Luke declared, his voice hard. "You've got legal title. They can't just take it." "Ah, they can try," Inez said grimly. "And they will. No neighbors close enough to witness trouble. No law near enough to help in time. You've got witnesses now." Jamie spoke up from where he sat on the stairs. "We seen them papers. We can testify they're real." The other brothers nodded firmly. "And more than that," Luke added, "you've got help if trouble comes. We may not look like much, but 7 brothers can make a fair showing in a fight." Kea stared at them, surprise clear on her face. "You'd stand with me against the railroad. You don't even know me." "We know enough," Sam said simply. "Know you took in 7 strangers in a blizzard. Know you fed us, tended our hurts, shared your shelter. Know you're fighting to keep what's rightfully yours. That's all we need to know," Daniel added. Inez looked around at their earnest faces, something softening in her stern expression. After a moment, she nodded. "Help me get these papers back in order," she said gruffly. But the brothers could hear the emotion she was hiding. They spent the next hour carefully organizing the documents, Inez explaining the significance of each. 1. The land patent itself, the military commendations for her husband's service, the marriage certificate that proved her claim as his widow. Even the original survey maps marking the valley's boundaries. When everything was safely stored away, they returned to their tasks outside. But something had changed. The brothers worked with new purpose, their eyes scanning the horizon more carefully, their movements more protective of the homestead and its owner. As evening approached, Inez surprised them by bringing out venison. From her store's meat she'd clearly been saving for special occasions. She set about preparing a stew, adding dried vegetables and precious spices. The cabin filled with savory aromas as the brothers cleaned up from their day's work. Outside, snow began falling more heavily again, but the sound of it against the windows seemed less threatening now. The home that had been Inez's solitary shelter for so long felt different with 7 brothers gathered around her fire. Thomas picked up his harmonica and played a quiet tune while they waited for supper. Jamie dozed in the warmth, while the other brothers talked softly among themselves. Inez moved between hearth and table, her usual efficiency tempered by a new awareness of the life filling her home. When she served the stew, there was no need to call for prayer. The brothers were already quiet, heads bowed, waiting for her strong voice to give thanks. Her prayer that night included gratitude, not just for food and shelter, but for new allies in time of need. The wind rose outside, driving snow against the cabin walls. But inside, as bowls were filled and bread was passed, the lonely silence that had ruled this home for so long gave way to the warm sounds of family, even if it was a family brought together by chance and necessity. Rather than blood, Inez watched the brothers eat, their presence already feeling less strange, more natural. She found herself remembering how to cook for many, how to move in a space shared with others, how to accept help and company as more than just temporary inconvenience. The storm's renewed fury rattled the windows, but within the cabin's walls, something had changed. The brothers' loyalty, freely offered, had breached defenses Inez had built over years of solitude. And though she maintained her stern demeanor, felt the warmth of it seeping into places long frozen by grief and loneliness. Morning arrived with a startling brightness that made the snow-covered landscape glitter like crushed diamonds. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind drifts taller than a man in some places. The brothers were already at work, clearing paths between the cabin, barn, and other outbuildings when Luke spotted movement on the ridge. "Riders coming," he called out, his voice carrying across the crisp morning air. From the north, Inez stepped out onto her porch, one hand shading her eyes against the glare. Through the crystalline air, she could make out 5 horsemen picking their way across the snow-drifted meadow. Their expensive wool coats and well-fed horses marked them as something other than simple cowboys. "Syndicate men," she said, her voice flat. She disappeared inside the cabin and returned moments later with her rifle. The brothers gathered closer to the cabin, their bodies tense but their movements unhurried. They'd seen enough trouble on the trail to know that showing fear only encouraged predators. The riders approached at a deliberate pace, their horses breaking through the snow's crust with each step. Their leader, a man with a silver-trimmed black coat and a derby hat, pulled up 20 yards from the cabin. His pale eyes took in the scene, the Apache woman on the porch with her rifle. The 7 blonde cowboys arrayed around her like a guard detail. A sneer twisted his thin lips. "Well now, what's this? A regular boarding house you're running here." His voice dripped with mock politeness. "Didn't know you were in the hospitality business, Mrs. Nate." "These men are my guests," Inez replied evenly. They waited out the storm. "Storm's over now," another rider called out. "Time for them to move along." The brothers didn't budge. Sam, the youngest, actually took a step closer to the porch. The leader's face hardened. "Listen here, boys," he addressed the brothers directly. "Name's Marshall Cooper. I represent the Western Rail and Cattle Syndicate. We've got plans for this valley that don't include squatters or their sympathizers. He spat the last word like it tasted bad. This land's patented, Daniel spoke up. Legal and proper. We've seen the papers ourselves. Cooper's laugh was sharp and ugly. Papers? You mean those army documents she waves around? Probably forged. Even if they weren't, no court's going to uphold an Apache claim over the railroad's interests. Progress is coming, boys. Best not to stand in its way. Inez's rifle didn't waver. My husband earned this land with his blood. The patent is real, and so is my claim. Your husband's dead, Cooper said bluntly, and you're alone out here. Things happen to lonely homesteads. Fires start. Accidents occur, especially when people make poor choices about their associations. His gaze swept meaningfully over the brothers. Luke stepped forward, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the cold air. Doesn't look like she's alone to me. Cooper's face darkened. When the thaw comes, we'll be back. If you're still here. He let the threat hang unfinished. Best pack up and clear out before then. All of you. He turned his horse, snow spraying from its hooves. Shame if anything happened to that fine cabin. Winter's still long and matches are cheap. The other riders wheeled their mounts around, following their leader. Their laughter drifted back, sharp as icicles in the morning air. No one moved until the riders disappeared over the ridge. Finally, Inez lowered her rifle, though her face remained set in stern lines. You boys should go, she said quietly. When the weather allows. They mean what they say about burning people out. We ain't going nowhere, Jamie declared, stamping. His feet against the cold. Got nowhere particular to be anyway, Thomas added with a shrug. Inez looked at each brother in turn, her dark eyes searching. This isn't your fight. Maybe not, Luke answered. But it's the right fight. Sometimes that's enough. The day passed in tense activity. The brothers doubled their efforts at clearing snow, but now they also checked sight lines, noted natural, defensive positions, and discussed in low voices how to fortify the cabin against night riders. They'd seen enough range wars to know how ugly things could get. Evening brought them all inside, where Inez had prepared a simple supper of salt pork and beans. The meal was quieter than usual. Everyone lost in their own thoughts about the morning's confrontation. After the dishes were cleared, the brothers gathered in their usual spot near the hearth, while Inez retired to her room. Their voices were low, but urgent. We can't leave her alone against those vultures, Sam insisted, still young enough to wear his heart openly. Ain't planning to, Luke assured him. Question is, what can 7 broke cowboys do against a railroad syndicate? Daniel, always the practical one, spoke up. We've got time. Snow's deep enough to keep them honest for a while. We use that time to prepare. Could try to get word to the army fort, Thomas suggested. They might back up their own patent. 40 miles in winter. Jamie shook his head. Be spring before anyone could make that ride. They fell silent as Inez's door creaked. She emerged with her Bible for evening prayers, pretending not to notice their huddled conference. But her movements were slower than usual, weighted with worry. The brothers exchanged glances. They'd spent years drifting from ranch to ranch, taking whatever work they could find. Now, watching this proud woman fight to keep her home, they recognized something worth standing for. More than that, they'd felt the warmth of her stern care, the blessing of her hospitality, the strength of her character. Reckon we found our cause, Luke murmured, and 6 heads nodded in agreement. Maybe even found something more, Sam added softly, watching Inez prepare for prayers. Been a long time since we had anywhere that felt like home, Daniel finished for him, and the words settled in their hearts like a warm coal, driving back the chill of Cooper's threats. The evening prayers that night had a special intensity. Inez's voice never wavered as she asked for protection and guidance. But the brothers noticed she included them by name for the first time. When the final amen was said, they remained seated around the fire, none of them eager to face the darkness. Alone? Outside, the wind picked up again, driving loose snow against the windows. But inside the cabin, something stronger than fear was taking root. The brothers had found a cause worth fighting for, and perhaps even more precious, a place where they belonged. The threats of the syndicate men hung heavy in the air, but they were outweighed by the simple truth that 7 brothers and 1 Apache widow had somehow become a family, ready to stand together against whatever came with the thaw. The storm showed. No signs of letting up, trapping everyone inside the cabin. Inez watched the brothers grow restless, pacing like caged mountain lions. She recognized the feeling the same restlessness had plagued her during her first winter alone. "Come," she said one morning, laying out strips of leather and sinew on the kitchen table. Idle hands make for troubled minds. The brothers gathered around, curious. Inez demonstrated how to braid the sinew into strong cord, her fingers moving. "With practiced grace, my people use this for snares," she explained. "Even in deep snow, rabbits must eat. They make trails we can read." Sam, the youngest, leaned in close. His hands trembled slightly. The encounter with Cooper's men had shaken him more than he admitted. But as Inez guided his fingers through the braiding pattern, his breathing steadied. "Like this?" he asked, holding up his first attempt. "Better than my first try," Inez answered, and the ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Tomorrow, when the snow lets up, I'll show you where to set." Them? Daniel, always practical, spoke up. "Could you teach us to read those tracks you mentioned? Might come in handy, knowing who's moving around out there." Inez nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. Yes, the snow tells stories if you know how to listen." The next day brought a brief break in the storm. Inez led the brothers into the woods behind the cabin, showing them how different creatures left distinct patterns in the snow. "See here," she pointed to a delicate trail of prints. "Rabbit moves like this. Hop, hop, pause." And here she indicated a different set. Fox follows, keeping to the shadows. Luke studied the tracks intently, like reading a story written in the snow. "That's right," Inez agreed. "And here's where we set the snare." She demonstrated how to place the braided cord just so, hiding it beneath a dusting of snow. The rabbit runs his usual path, but this time she let the lesson sink in. Back in the cabin, while their snares did their work, Inez taught them other skills. She showed them how to cure the pelts they'd eventually collect, how to stretch and smoke the leather to make it supple. The brothers proved to be quick learners, their calloused hands already accustomed to detailed work. "My father was a scout too," she told them as they worked. "He taught me to read the land, to listen to its voices. The Apache way is to take only what's needed, but to waste nothing of what's taken." The brothers exchanged glances. They'd grown up hearing very different stories about the Apache. But watching Inez's skilled hands, listening to her quiet wisdom, they began to understand how much they'd misunderstood. In return for her lessons, the brothers shared their own knowledge. Jamie, who'd worked as a bronc buster, demonstrated clever rope tricks that could help secure loads or rescue stranded cattle. Thomas showed her how to adjust stirrup lengths for better control in rough country. Miss Inez, Luke called one evening. "Reckon you might want to see this." He proceeded to demonstrate a complicated series of knots that could turn a simple rope into a makeshift ladder. "Miss Inez," she repeated softly, and though she tried to hide it, the brothers caught her smile before she turned away. The evenings brought a different kind of sharing. Daniel pulled out his mouth harp, a battered thing he'd carried through every cattle drive. The sweet notes filled the cabin, pushing back the darkness. The other brothers joined in with familiar trail songs, their voices blending in well-practiced harmony. Inez sat in her chair, listening. She remembered her husband, singing to her, his voice rough but warm. The memory didn't hurt as much as it usually did. Thomas had found some wood scraps in the lean-to and set about carving them with his pocket knife. His skilled hands brought forth small animals' horses, rabbits, birds each, one carefully detailed. When he finished a particularly fine wolf, he set it on the mantel without ceremony. "For the cabin," he said simply, when Inez raised an eyebrow. Sam, still struggling with nightmares about Cooper's men, often woke in the night. He'd find Inez already up, tending the fire. She never coddled him, but her quiet strength helped. She'd put him to work, teaching him to bank the coals properly, or telling him stories about the stars his people followed. "You're getting stronger," she told him one night, watching him stack wood without trembling. "Fear doesn't last forever, not if you face it." The days fell into a rhythm. Mornings brought lessons in tracking and trapping. Afternoons were filled with practical tasks, gearing meat, repairing gear, preparing for the threats they knew would come with spring. Evenings belonged to music and storytelling, with Daniel's mouth harp providing accompaniment to tales of cattle drives and Apache wisdom. Jamie, who had a fine singing voice, taught Inez an old hymn his mother used to sing. Though she knew the words from her husband's Bible readings, she'd never heard it with harmony. When the brothers all joined in, their voices rising to the cabin's rafters, she had to look away to hide the moisture in her eyes. "You boys sing almost as well as you eat," she said gruffly, but her tone held warmth. "I praise indeed, miss." Inez, Luke grinned, using the title that had become their way of showing respect. Even the cabin itself seemed to come alive. Thomas's carved figures multiplied on the mantel, telling stories in wood. Daniel's music filled corners that had been silent for years. The brothers had arranged their bedrolls in a way that made the main room feel like a proper bunkhouse, their presence somehow making the space larger instead of more crowded. One evening, as Inez stirred a pot of beans, she realized she was humming one of the brothers' trail songs. She stopped, surprised at herself. But then Sam picked up the tune with his clear young voice, and soon all the brothers joined in. This time, Inez didn't bother hiding her smile. She looked around her cabinette, the carved figures standing guard. On her mantel, at the cured pelts hanging from their first successful snares. At 7 blonde heads bent over various tasks in the firelight. For the first time since losing her husband, the cabin felt full of life again. "Miss Inez," Sam called out, holding up a piece of sinew braiding. "Reckon this one's ready for setting." She moved to inspect his work, ladle still in hand. The braiding was neat and tight, better than she'd expected. "Well done," she said, and the boy's face lit up at her approval. Behind her ladle, Inez's smile grew wider. She'd forgotten how good it felt to teach, to watch young minds grasp new skills. She'd forgotten how a home could be filled with more than just memories. The brothers had begun calling her cabin home when they thought she couldn't hear. She didn't correct them. Perhaps they all needed this, not just shelter from the storm, but a place to belong. A family cobbled together from loss and loneliness and the simple act of sharing what they knew. Outside, the storm continued its patrol of the valley, but inside the cabin, something warmer than weather was taking hold. Skill by skill, song by song, smile by hidden smile. They were building something stronger than the winds could shake. The morning brought patches of blue sky between the clouds. The wind had settled enough that tracks wouldn't vanish moments after being made. Luke and Daniel, the two steadiest of the brothers, volunteered to ride into Silvervale for supplies. "Be careful," Inez warned, handing them a carefully written list. "Townfolk can be quick to judge what they don't understand." Luke tucked the list into his coat. "Yes'm, we'll keep our heads down and our ears open." The ride into town took nearly 2 hours, their horses plowing through deep drifts. Silvervale emerged from the whiteness like a painting coming into focus. A scatter of wooden buildings with smoke rising from stone chimneys. the church steeple reaching toward heaven. The general store's bell jingled as they entered. Warmth from the potbelly stove hit them first, followed by the mixed scents of coffee, leather, and tobacco. Old Man Turner looked up from his ledger, his weathered face creasing with suspicion. "Haven't seen you boys before," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Just passing through," Daniel answered smoothly. "Need some supplies to wait out the weather." They began gathering items from Inez's list: coffee, flour, sugar, kerosene for the lamps. As they worked, whispered conversations drifted between the shelves. "Heard tell of a giant Indian woman up valley," one voice muttered. "Living alone all these years, acting high and mighty with that land claim of hers. Now she's got herself some cowboys," another added. "Whole pack of them, all yellow-headed like sunflowers." Luke's shoulders tensed, but Daniel caught his eye and shook his head slightly. They kept working, pretending not to hear. "Ain't natural," the first voice continued. "That land's prime grazing. Railroad's been trying to get it proper sorted for months now. Should just run her off," someone suggested. "Ain't right. Her holding that valley when honest folk could use it." The bell jingled again. A young woman entered, shaking snow from her shawl. Her presence seemed to quiet the gossip, though dark looks still passed between the men lounging. Near the stove, the woman approached Luke and Daniel as they loaded their supplies onto the counter. "You gentlemen look like you could use an extra lamp," she said quietly. "The nights are long this time of year." She reached past them and added a brass kerosene lamp to their pile. Her movements were quick but deliberate as she also slipped a leather-bound hymn books beneath the lamp. "My father says good music brings light to dark places," she added, her voice still low. "I'm Ruth Cooper. My father's the preacher here." Daniel nodded carefully. "Much obliged, miss." "Pa served with John and H. during the treaties," she continued, helping them wrap the lamp in paper. "Said he was a man of honor, true to both sides. His widow still carries that honor, or so Pa says." Luke's hands stilled on the counter. "Your pa sounds like a wise man." "He is." Ruth glanced toward the men by the stove, then back to the brothers. "He also says wisdom often comes wrapped in unexpected packages. Some folks here just need time to see it." Old Man Turner finished tallying their purchases. Ruth helped them load everything into their wagon, slipping them an extra package of coffee without adding it to their bill. "Tell Miss Nate that some of us remember," she whispered. "Some of us know what's right." The brothers touched their hats in thanks and turned their wagon toward home. The return journey felt longer, weighted with both supplies and worry. They found Inez in the barn, mending harness with her usual precise stitches. The other brothers helped unload the wagon while Luke and Daniel shared what they'd heard. "Town stirred up something fierce," Luke reported. "Lots of talk about the land and about you." Inez's needle never faltered. Always has been. Always will be. "But we met someone friendly, too," Daniel added. "Preacher's daughter, Ruth Cooper. Said her pa served with your husband." Now Inez's hands did pause. "Jonathan Cooper. Yes, a good man when many weren't." That evening, as lamplight pushed back the darkness, they gathered for supper. The new brass lamp cast a warm glow over the table, where Inez had laid out a stew rich with rabbit meat and winter vegetables. The Coopers might be allies, Luke suggested, breaking cornbread into his bowl. Ruth seemed genuine in her offer of friendship. "Might be," Inez agreed. "But we can't count on it. Townfolk are like weather can turn mighty quick when pressure builds." Sam, the youngest, looked up from his stew. "But they can't really take your land, can they?" "Not with legal papers and all." Inez's face grew stern. "Papers are only as strong as those willing to enforce them. Armies pulled back since the treaties. Laws spread thin out here." "Well, they'll have to go through us first," Jamie declared, his young face fierce in the lamplight. "Hush now," Inez said, but her voice held warmth. "Eat your supper before it cools." They ate in thoughtful silence for a while. The new hymn books sat on the mantel beside Thomas's carvings, their leather covers gleaming softly. "Miss Inez," Daniel said finally, "would you mind if we sang a bit later? Seems to me some of those hymns might do us good." Inez nodded, and if her eyes seemed brighter than usual, none of the brothers mentioned it. Reckon they might at that. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. But inside the cabin, voices soon rose in harmony, mixing trail songs with hymns while the new lamp burned bright and steady. Thomas added another log to the fire. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "we face it together." Inez looked around her table at 7 blonde heads bowed over their bowls. At the new lamp casting its glow, at the hymn books promising comfort in hard times. She thought of Jonathan Cooper and his steadfast faith in justice, of his daughter Ruth carrying that faith forward. Together, she agreed, and began clearing the supper dishes as Daniel's mouth harp started a familiar tune. Morning dawned clear and bright. The first, truly cloudless sky they had seen in weeks. Sunlight sparkled off the snow-covered valley like scattered diamonds, and a warm breeze whispered promises of spring. Inez stood at her cabin door, coffee cup warming her hands, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge. Behind her, the cabin stirred with life. The brothers were already up, their morning routines now familiar after weeks of shared space. The clatter of tin cups and bowls mixed with quiet conversation and the occasional laugh. The scent of cornbread warming on the stove filled the air. Miss Inez called Matthew, the third eldest. "Looks like the weather's finally breaking." She nodded, still watching the horizon. "About time. There's work needs doing." The brothers finished their breakfast quickly, eager to be outside in the sunshine. They pulled on boots and coats, filing out into the bright morning. The snow had developed. A thick crust overnight, strong enough to walk on in most places. "First things to clear paths," Inez directed, setting down her coffee cup. "To the barn, the well, and the gate. Then we see what winter's broken." They set to work with shovels and picks, breaking through the crusty snow. The physical labor felt good after being cooped up so long. Steam rose from their shoulders as they worked, and their breath clouded in the crisp air. Luke and Daniel tackled the path to the barn, while Sam and Jamie cleared the way to the well. Thomas and Matthew worked toward the gate, and William, the eldest, helped Inez check the cabin's foundation for any damage from the heavy snows. "Post is loose here," William pointed out, examining where the porch met the ground. "Snow's pushed. It's sideways some." Inez knelt to inspect it. "Good eye. We'll shore it up once the ground thaws proper." By midday, they had cleared all the essential paths. Melting snow dripped from the cabin's eaves, creating narrow channels in the remaining drifts. The brothers gathered by the water trough, which had developed a crack from the freezing temperatures. "We can fix this," Thomas said, running his hand along the split wood. "Got some spare boards in the barn? That'll do fine." Inez watched from the porch as they worked together, passing tools and holding boards in place. Their movements had grown synchronized over their weeks together, each anticipating the other's needs. The sound of hammering echoed across the valley, accompanied by snatches of trail songs and good-natured teasing. After the trough was mended, they turned their attention to the fences. Several sections had buckled under the snow's weight, and posts needed to be reset. They worked in teams, digging through the frozen ground to secure the posts properly. "Miss Inez," Sam called out during a break, "we've been thinking, would it be all right if we put up a proper cross?" By the gate, Inez paused in her work, her face unreadable. "For what purpose?" "Well," Sam continued, suddenly nervous, "seems right. To have something showing this is a Christian home might help some folks understand better. She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. My husband would have liked that. There's good oak in the barn we can use. The brothers set to work with renewed energy. William and Thomas selected the wood carefully, while Daniel sketched out the proportions. They worked with reverence, sharing quiet words as they shaped the cross. Inez watched them from the corner of her eye as she continued mending fences. Their care in the task touched something deep in her heart, something that had been sleeping since her husband's death. As the afternoon sun began to slide toward the mountains, they raised the cross together. They set it deep in the ground by the gatepost, securing it against future storms. Inez stood back, studying their work. The clean lines of the oak stood stark against the snow, a silent testament to faith and belonging. "Looks right," she said simply, but her voice held warmth. The day's work had left them tired but satisfied. They gathered on the porch as dusk approached, watching the sky turn purple and gold. Matthew brought out his mouth harp, and Thomas produced one of the hymn books Ruth had given them. "Shall we?" Daniel asked, looking at Inez. She nodded, settling into her chair. Something quiet to match the evening. Matthew played a few soft notes, finding the key. Then Daniel's voice rose clear and strong, singing the first lines of Amazing Grace. One by one, the other brothers joined in, their voices blending in practiced harmony. The hymn floated out across the valley, echoing off the snow-covered hills. They moved from song to song, some from the hymnal, others remembered from their mother's knee. Inez remained silent, but her fingers tapped gently against her chair arm, keeping time as they sang the old rugged cross. Inez stood quietly and walked to the doorway. She leaned against the frame, watching the last light fade from the sky. Stars were beginning to appear, bright and clear in the winter air. The brothers' voices wrapped around her like a warm blanket, filling spaces that had been empty for so long she remembered other evenings. With John beside her, his deep voice joining her own in songs of praise. The memory didn't bring the usual sharp pain. Instead, it felt like a blessing, a bridge between past and present. The harmony swelled as they began "It is well with my soul." The peace in the words seemed to settle over the homestead like a gentle snow. For this moment, there were no threats, no prejudices, no losses too heavy to bear. There was only the music, the stars, and the family that God had brought together in the midst of a storm. Jamie started another song, one of the trail ballads they'd learned as children. Its simple melody spoke of home and hope and journey's ending. The other brothers joined in, their voices weaving together as naturally as breathing. Even Sam, who usually claimed he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, added his voice to the chorus. Inez remained in the doorway, her tall frame silhouetted against the lamplight spilling from within. Her heart felt full in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. The silence that had ruled her home for so long had been replaced by something better, something that spoke of family and faith, and futures yet to unfold. As the last notes faded into the evening air, no one spoke immediately. The peace of the moment was too precious to break. The new cross by the gate stood as a silent guardian, its shadow stretching long in the starlight. Finally, Thomas closed the hymnal gently. "Thank you, Miss Inez," he said softly, "for everything." She turned from the doorway, her eyes bright in the lamplight. "Time for supper," she said, her voice holding more gentleness than they had yet heard. "Come in before the cold takes back what the sun gave today." They filed inside, bringing with them the contentment of work well done and songs well sung. The cabin glowed with warmth and lamplight, no longer a solitary shelter, but a true home, filled with the sounds and presence. A family, the peace of their hymn-singing evening shattered with the acrid smell of smoke. Luke, the youngest brother at 16, noticed it first. His head snapped up from the checkers game he'd been playing with Daniel. "Something's burning," he said, his voice tight with alarm. William rushed to the window, wiping frost from the glass. An orange glow painted the night sky to the north, where their cattle had been sheltering in a protected valley. The flames danced against the snow-laden clouds, growing brighter by the second. "The herd?" Sam shouted, already reaching for his coat. Inez moved with swift precision, grabbing her medical kit and extra blankets. "Take weapons," she ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. "They'll be waiting." The brothers scrambled for rifles and revolvers, pulling on boots and heavy coats. The night air hit them like a slap as they burst from the cabin's warmth. Their boots crunched through the crusty snow as they ran toward the hellish glow, leaving Inez standing guard at the door, rifle ready. The closer they got, the worse it became. The syndicate men had set fire to the dry winter grass around the herd, creating a blazing circle that panicked the cattle. Bellowing filled the air as the animals crashed into each other, trying to escape the flames. The acrid stench of burning hair and flesh turned their stomachs. "Cut them out," William shouted. Over the roar of the fire, drive them toward the creek. The brothers spread out, trying to guide the terrified animals through a gap in the flames. But the cattle, blind with fear, refused to move in any organized way. Some crashed through the fire, their hides ablaze, while others trampled each other. In their panic, Luke worked his way around the edge of the herd, trying to calm a group of young steers. The firelight cast everything in savage orange shadows, making it hard to see clearly. He didn't notice the rider until it was too late. The first shot cracked across the valley like breaking ice. Luke felt something hot tear across his upper arm, spinning him around. He stumbled, falling face first into the snow. More shots followed, forcing his brothers to dive for cover. "Luke!" Thomas screamed, seeing his youngest brother sprawled in the snow. Blood spread across Luke's sleeve, dark against the white ground. Daniel and Sam provided covering fire, while Thomas and Jamie belly crawled through the snow to reach Luke. The boy was conscious, but dazed, his face pale in the firelight. They grabbed his coat and dragged him backward, away from the shooting. William's voice cut through the chaos. "Fall back. Get him to the cabin." The brothers retreated, half carrying Luke between them. Behind them, their cattle continued to burn and die, their cries filling the night with horror. Occasionally, a shot would kick up snow near their feet. But the syndicate men seemed more interested in destroying the herd than killing the cowboys. Inez met them at the door, her tall frame blocking the lamplight. "Bring him to the table," she commanded, already clearing it of dishes. Her medical kit lay open, herbs and bandages ready. They lifted Luke onto the wooden surface while Inez cut away his bloody sleeve. The bullet had carved a deep furrow across his upper arm, but hadn't lodged in the flesh. Blood pulsed steadily from the wound. "Hold him still," she ordered, pressing a cloth against the injury. Luke groaned but didn't struggle as she cleaned the wound with whiskey and began applying a poultice of herbs. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. Showing no hesitation, the other brothers paced or stood frozen, their faces haunted by more than Luke's injury. Through the windows, the orange glow continued to paint the night sky. The loss of their herd represented more than just dead cattle. It was their entire future going up in flames. "How many?" Nez asked quietly as she wrapped Luke's arm in clean bandages. "Most of them," William answered, his voice hollow. "Maybe all." They set fire to the grass in a circle, drove them into it. No way to get them out in time. Daniel slammed his fist against the wall. Everything we had was in that herd. 3 years of saving, of working other men's ranches, of planning. His voice broke. Sam sank into a chair, his face in his hands. "We're ruined," he whispered. "All of it. Just gone." Luke tried to sit up, but Inez pressed him back down with a firm hand. "Be still," she said. The bleeding's not stopped yet. The boy's face was tear-streaked. Whether from pain or loss, no one could tell. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I should have seen them coming." "Hush," Inez said, her voice gentler than they'd ever heard it. "This isn't your doing." The brothers huddled near the fire, shock settling over them like a heavy blanket. The warmth and hope they'd felt just hours ago seemed like a dream now. Reality had returned with brutal force, reminding them that the world had no place for 7 orphaned cowboys and an Apache widow. Jamie picked up one of the quilts they'd used during the blizzard, now stained with Luke's blood. "We can't stay," he said quietly. "They'll come for the cabin next. We've brought nothing but trouble to your door, Miss Inez." But Inez's face had taken on the stern set they recognized from their first night at her door. "This is my land," she said, tying off Luke's bandage with a firm knot. "My husband's grave is on this soil. I will not be driven from it by men who burn and shoot in the dark." She straightened to her full height, looking each brother in the eye. "You chose to stand with me against them. Now I stand with you. We face this together." Thomas shook his head. "But we've got nothing left. No cattle, no money. We have each other." Inez cut him off. "And sometimes family is worth more than herds." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The brothers looked at each other, then at this tall, fierce woman who had taken them in and tended their wounds. Something shifted in the room, a determination replacing their despair. William stood, his face set. "Miss Inez is right. We're not finished yet." Outside, the glow of the fire began to fade as the last of their herd succumbed to the flames. But inside the cabin, a different kind of fire was kindling, one made of loyalty, courage, and the bonds of chosen family. Their brief peace had been shattered. Their hopes seemed burned to ash. But they were not defeated. Luke drifted into an uneasy sleep on the table, his wounded arm carefully bandaged. The other brothers took up positions around the cabin, watching for any sign the syndicate men might return. Inez moved between them, dispensing coffee and quiet strength. The night stretched long before them, filled with the dying echoes of their herds, death cries, and the weight of decisions yet to be made. But they would face whatever came together, bound by something stronger than blood or business. The choice to stand as family against the darkness. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet as midnight approached. Luke lay on Inez's bed, his bandaged arm propped on pillows, his breathing shallow but steady. The other brothers had stationed themselves at windows and the door, rifles ready. Watching for any sign of the syndicate men's return, Inez knelt beside the bed, her tall frame bent in prayer. Her lips moved silently, first in the Apache words of her childhood, then in the English prayers her husband had taught her. The familiar rhythms of both languages brought a measure of comfort as she pleaded for the boy's healing. "Shia Sash," she whispered, using the Apache word for God before switching to English. "Lord, protect this child. Give me the strength to see him through this night." The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. William stoked it carefully, trying not to disturb the heavy silence. Every so often, Luke would stir and moan, bringing all eyes to his pale face, as Inez dabbed Luke's forehead with a cool cloth. Memories of her husband's final days washed over her. John had been strong until the end, even as the fever took him. His last words had been a promise she had clung to through years of solitude. "God hasn't abandoned you, my love. He'll send others when the time is right." She looked at the 6 brothers scattered around her cabin. These blonde cowboys who had stumbled out of a blizzard and into her life. Had this been what John meant? Her throat tightened at the thought. Thomas approached quietly, offering her a cup of coffee. "How is he?" he whispered. The bleeding has stopped, Inez replied, keeping her voice low. But he's weak. We must watch for fever. Thomas nodded, then hesitated. Miss Inez, his voice caught. We ain't had nobody looking after us since Ma and Pa died. Not really. Then you took us in, and it felt, he swallowed hard. It felt like maybe we weren't orphans no more. Inez's hands stilled on the cloth. She looked up to see tears tracking down Thomas's weathered face. Now this happens, he continued, gesturing to his wounded brother. Our herd gone, Luke shot. Feels like we're being orphaned all over again. Not just from family, but from hope itself. Samuel spoke up from his post by the window. We was finally starting to believe in something again. In having a real home, someday. In being part of something bigger than just surviving, Daniel added softly. The other brothers nodded, their faces showing the same raw fear of loss that Inez recognized from her own mirror. She had seen it every day after John died, when she thought she would suffocate from loneliness. Jamie, who had been silent since the shooting, moved closer to the bed. Miss Inez, how do you do it? Stay out here alone, I mean, with everyone trying to take what's yours. Inez was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on Luke's good arm. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. I am never truly alone, she said. My husband taught me that. The land holds his memory. The cabin holds our dreams. And God, she touched the worn Bible on the bedside table. God holds my faith, even when I doubt. Luke stirred then, his eyes fluttering open. Miss Inez, he called weakly. I am here, child, she answered, bending closer. Don't let go, he whispered, his hand seeking hers. Please don't let go. Inez clasped his fingers firmly. I won't, she promised, and in that moment she knew she was making the promise to all of them. The night deepened. The brothers took turns keeping watch while Inez maintained her vigil. She prayed in Apache when the fear felt too big for English. Words, the ancient language of her people, flowing like water over stones. She prayed in English when she needed to feel John's presence, remembering how he had taught her the Lord's Prayer, one word at a time. Sometimes she sang softly, old healing songs her grandmother had used. The brothers listened, transfixed by the unfamiliar melody that somehow spoke directly to their hearts. William brought her another cup of coffee as false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. You should rest, he said gently. Inez shook her head. I have spent too many nights alone, she replied. Now that God has sent me children to watch over, I will not waste a moment of it. The word children hung in the air between them. William's eyes filled with tears, he quickly blinked away. The first real light of morning crept through the windows, cold and gray. Luke's wound, when Inez checked it, showed no signs of infection, but the boy was pale and weak from blood loss. She changed the bandage with careful hands, murmuring prayers as she worked. Samuel came in from checking the yard. No sign of them, he reported. But the herd. He couldn't finish the sentence. They all knew what lay in the meadow. The charred remains of their dreams, their independence, their future. The loss hung heavy in the air, threatening to crush their spirits. Inez straightened. From tending Luke, her full height commanding attention. Listen to me, she said, her voice firm but gentle. I know what it is to lose everything, to feel abandoned by God and man alike. But my husband was right. God does not abandon his children. He brings them together in new ways. She looked at each brother in turn, seeing their fear, their hope, their desperate need to belong somewhere. You are not orphans, she declared. Not while I draw a breath. This cabin has been too quiet for too long. Perhaps, she paused, touching the cross that hung at her throat. Perhaps God sent you to me as much as he sent me to you. The brothers stared at her, stunned by the declaration. Luke's grip on her hand tightened. "You mean that?" Jamie asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I do not say things I do not mean," Inez replied. "My people believe that family is more than blood. It is choice. It is loyalty. It is standing together when the storm comes." She gestured to the room around them. "This is your home now, if you want it. We will face whatever comes together." The morning light strengthened, filling the cabin with a pale golden glow. Luke's fever had not worsened, though he remained weak. The family gathered close to his bedside, drawn together by something stronger than their fears. They were broken. Yes, wounded in body and spirit, their hopes seemingly burned to ash in the night. But as Inez resumed her quiet prayers, mixing Apache and English in a testament to how love could bridge any divide, something new began to take root in their hearts. It was fragile as a spring seedling. This feeling of belonging, yet like the tough prairie grass that survived both drought and fire, it held the promise of growing stronger through adversity. They were no longer just 7 orphaned cowboys and a lonely Apache widow. They were becoming something else, a family forged in fire, held together by choice and faith and love. The morning stretched cold and uncertain before them, but they would face it together. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Silver Vales. Muddy Main Street as Inez's wagon approached. The brothers had insisted she ride in the bed, propped against hay bales beside Luke, who drifted in and out of sleep. Thomas and William flanked the wagon on horseback, their eyes sharp for trouble. Samuel handled the reins with care, mindful of every rut that might jostle his wounded brother. The leather land patent rested in Inez's satchel, its presence heavy. With promise and danger both, she had not wanted to leave the cabin, but the brothers convinced her they needed allies, and quickly. "Folks are staring," Jamie muttered from his perch on the wagon seat. Indeed, townsfolk stopped in their tracks as the unusual party passed. Women clutched their shawls closer. Men's hands drifted toward gun belts. "Let them stare," Inez said quietly. "I have faced worse than stares." They drew up before the white-painted church where Reverend Morrison held morning service. The brothers helped Luke from the wagon, supporting him between them. Inez unfolded her tall frame and stepped down, head high despite the whispers that followed her movement. The church door stood open. Inside, the morning sermon was wrapping up, voices raised in a final hymn. As the group waited on the steps, people began filing out. The crowd grew still at the sight of them. "What's this about?" someone called. "Why are you bringing an Indian to church?" "That's John Naitch's widow," another voice answered. "The one living up valley with those cowboys." Reverend Morrison appeared in the doorway, his daughter, Sarah, close. Behind, the preacher's weathered face showed surprise, but no fear or judgment. "Mrs. Naitch," he said, inclining his head. "Welcome to God's house." "Thank you, Reverend." Inez's voice carried clear and strong. "I have come seeking witness to truth." She withdrew the patent from her satchel, the paper crackling in the morning air. "My husband filed this claim, legal and proper. The land is mine by law and by right." The crowd pressed closer. Sarah Morrison stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Father," she said softly, "you served with John Naitch. You know the truth of this." The Reverend nodded slowly. "That I did. A finer scout never rode for the army. A man of deep faith and honor both. It's a fraud." The shout came from the back of the crowd. "No Indian woman can hold white man's land." "The law says different," Samuel spoke up, his voice steady. "We've read the patent ourselves. It's proper and true." More voices rose in argument. The brothers drew closer to Inez and Luke, forming a protective circle. The tension grew thick as summer. Storm clouds. Sheriff Dorsey pushed through the crowd, his badge catching the morning light. "Let me see that paper," he said, holding out his hand. Inez passed it over. The sheriff studied it carefully, lips moving as he read. "Seems in order," he admitted finally. "Filed with the land office, signed by the territorial governor himself. But she's Apache," someone protested. "You can't let her defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed." Reverend Morrison's voice cut through the clamor, quoting scripture with quiet authority. Psalm 82, verse 3. He moved to stand beside Inez, his presence commanding attention. I knew John Naich, served beside him, prayed with him. He was a man who followed God's law and man's law both. When he married Inez, he did right by her in every way, including securing this land for their future. The preacher's eyes swept the crowd. Now he's gone, and some would steal from his widow. Some would drive out the orphaned and friendless who found shelter with her. He gestured to the brothers, to Luke's pale face. Is this how we honor God's commands? Persecuting those he tells us to protect. Sarah stepped up beside her. Father, taking Inez's hand in a gesture that drew gasps from the crowd. Mrs. Naich helped tend our sick when the fever came through last winter, she reminded them. She sent herbs and honey when we needed them. Are we to repay kindness with cruelty? The sheriff cleared his throat. Law's the law, he said gruffly. Patent's valid. Anyone tries interfering with Mrs. Naich's property rights will answer to me. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some turned away, muttering darkly, but others nodded slowly. The preacher's words had struck home. Inez stood straight and tall, dignity in every line of her bearing. The morning sun caught the silver cross at her throat, a gift from John that she had never removed. In that moment, with the brothers arrayed around her and allies stepping forward at last, hope flickered like a freshly lit lamp in the darkness. The days after the church confrontation brought 10 expected gifts to Inez's homestead. Old Man Peterson's wagon creaked up the path one morning, loaded with fresh-cut timber for the corrals. Ain't right, what them syndicate boys did, he muttered, helping the brothers unload. Reckon fences need fixing proper like. Sarah Morrison organized a circle of church ladies, arriving with baskets of cornbread, dried apples, and salted pork. The Lord provides through many hands, she said simply. Setting the food on Inez's table, even the children of Silvervale contributed, guided by their mothers. Little Emma Thompson proudly presented a patchwork quilt sewn from scraps of calico and wool. For the hurt cowboy, she explained, her eyes wide at Inez's towering height. Not everyone approved. The brothers still caught dark looks and muttered threats when they rode into town for supplies. But the kindness outweighed the spite. Luke gained strength daily, propped up in bed while Inez shared stories of coyotes' tricks and Apache warriors' bravery. Her voice, mixing English and Apache words, blended with the hymns the brothers sang during evening prayers. Under Inez's firm direction, the Cowboys set to work building a stronger fence line. Their laughter, cautious at first, grew more frequent. As the posts rose straight and true against the Colorado sky, the saloon doors swung wide as James Crawford, the syndicate leader, stormed in with murder in his eyes. That Apache woman's claim is forged, he snarled, slamming papers on the bar. We're riding out tonight to settle this. Sheriff Dorsey's weathered hand settled on his badge, remembering the oath he'd sworn years ago. The weight of it pressed against his chest like iron. You'll do no such thing, he said, voice steady. I've seen the patent myself. It's legal as sunrise, and Inez Naich is under the protection of the law. His fingers brushed his revolver's grip. Any man who rides against her or those boys will face steel bars, not open range. Crawford's face twisted. Since when do you protect? Since I swore to uphold the law, Dorsey cut in. Not prejudice, not fear. The law. The syndicate men shuffled their boots, eyes downcast. Crawford spat and stalked out, his men trailing behind like whipped dogs. That evening, the brothers shared the news over Inez's rabbit stew. When they finished, something remarkable happened. Inez laughed, rich and deep as summer thunder. "My foolish boys," she said, shaking her head, "always finding trouble." But her dark eyes shone with pride. Spring whispered across the valley, melting snow into rich mud. Inez stood at the edge of her field, watching the 7 brothers work the softened earth with hoes and spades. Their blond heads bobbed like wheat. In the morning light, "Here," she said, showing them how to plant corn in the Apache way, deep enough to reach the moisture. Her strong hands demonstrated the proper depth. The borrowed plow horse nickered as they broke new ground. In the distance, fresh-built corrals stood sturdy, ready for the handful of calves gifted by sympathetic neighbors. The young cattle grazed peacefully. The start of a new herd. Preacher Mills arrived at sundown, his daughter carrying baskets of bread. Townsfolk trickled in behind them, keeping careful distance but drawn by curiosity. The preacher raised his hands at the cabin gate. "Lord, bless this land and these people you've brought together," he prayed. Hymns rose from uncertain throats, growing stronger as voices found courage to join. That evening, Inez gazed across her transformed homestead gardens, sprouting, smoke rising from the chimney, laughter echoing where silence once ruled. At the long table inside, 8 plates waited where once there was one. Her family bowed their heads together, saying grace over fresh bread and hope. Autumn painted the valley in golden light. Inside the cabin, warmth and chatter filled every corner. The long table groaned under platters of venison, cornbread, and late-harvest vegetables. 8 plates circled the wooden surface, no longer just one. "Mother, pass the beans," asked the youngest brother, his wound long healed. The word mother flowed naturally now, months of love having washed away any hesitation. Inez handed over the steaming bowl, her stern face softening. Around her sat not just her 7 sons, but townsfolk too, the preacher and his daughter, ranchers and their wives. The same people who once whispered about the giant Apache woman now sought her wisdom about weather patterns and herb lore. After supper, voices lifted in song. Hymns mixed with laughter floated through open windows into the crisp evening air. Inez stepped onto the porch, gazing at stars scattered like silver coins across the dark sky. Her land stretched peaceful before her, the corrals full, the garden harvested. "Thank you," she whispered in both Apache and English, her heart full, "for turning my empty house into a home filled with sons." Inside, the boys started another song. Their mother smiled and turned back to join them, knowing loneliness would never again darken her door. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.